Tonopah, Nevada, August 15, 1988. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but Angela Pierce kept refilling the same trucker's cup anyway. The Desert Rose Diner hummed with the familiar symphony of late-night Nevada, 18-wheelers growling past on Highway 95, the ancient air conditioner rattling against the August heat, and the soft clink of quarters dropping into the jukebox that only played half its songs anymore. At 24, Angela had been working the graveyard shift for 3 years, watching the same faces drift in and out like tumbleweeds, truckers heading to Reno, tourists lost between Vegas and nowhere, and the occasional local who couldn't sleep. The tips were decent enough, and the solitude gave her time to study her nursing textbooks between customers. "More coffee, Hon?" she asked Jimmy Kellerman, a regular who drove freight between California and Utah. His hands were permanently stained with motor oil, and he always ordered the same thing, pie and black coffee. "You're an angel, Angie," Jimmy said, not looking up from his newspaper. The headline read something about a drought affecting the county, but in Tonopah, drought was just another word for Tuesday. The diner's owner, Martha Chen, had left Angela to close alone again. It was nearly 2 a.m. when the last customer finally left, leaving behind the scent of diesel fuel and cigarettes. Angela wiped down the counter for the final time, her movements automatic after years of the same routine. She counted the till, $47 in tips, not bad for a Monday night, and locked the register. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars so bright they seemed close enough to pluck. The Silver Star Motel across the highway flickered with dying neon, its pink and blue light casting long shadows on the cracked asphalt. Only 3 rooms showed any light behind their curtains. Angela walked to her beat-up Honda Civic, keys jingling in the desert silence. She had parked under the single streetlight in the lot, a habit her mother had drilled into her since she was 16. The car's engine turned over on the 3rd try, coughing to life like an old man waking from a nap. As she pulled onto Highway 95, Angela noticed a figure standing outside room 6 at the Silver Star. A man in a dark jacket, smoking a cigarette. Their eyes met briefly in her headlights before she turned toward her trailer on the edge of town. She thought nothing of it then. Motels were for strangers, and strangers passed through Tonopah every night. The last person to see Angela Pierce alive was night clerk Tommy Valdez at the gas station on Pine Street. She had stopped for a Coke and a pack of gum at 2:27 a.m. The timestamp on the security camera would later confirm. Tommy remembered her seeming tired but cheerful, mentioning something about finally saving enough money to move to Reno in the fall. Angela's trailer sat alone on 3 acres of scrubland her father had left her, surrounded by Joshua trees and silence. She had painted the front door turquoise the year before, the same color as the 1979 Cadillac she was slowly restoring in the makeshift garage. It was her pride and joy, a car that had belonged to her grandmother, full of memories and dreams of the open road. When Angela didn't show up for her shift the next evening, Martha Chen called the Nye County Sheriff's Office. Deputy Sarah Hoffman drove out to the trailer and found the front door unlocked, Angela's purse on the kitchen table, and her uniform hanging clean in the closet. The Cadillac sat in the garage, hood up, tools scattered around as if she'd been working on the engine, but Angela Pierce was gone, vanished into the vast Nevada night like heat rising from summer asphalt. Tonopah, Nevada, August 1988 to December 1989. Detective Roy Kastner had worked missing persons cases for 15 years, but something about Angela Pierce's disappearance felt different from the start. He was a thin man with prematurely gray hair and eyes that had seen too much of what people could do to each other. The desert had a way of swallowing people whole, but it usually left clues, abandoned cars, scattered belongings, something. Angela had simply vanished. She was planning to leave anyway, Chief Deputy Mike Torres said during the 3rd week of the investigation, shuffling through the growing stack of reports. "Young woman, no family left in town, probably met some guy passing through. You know how it is." But Kastner didn't buy it. Angela's savings account remained untouched, $2,147 she'd been carefully accumulating for nursing school. Her clothes were still in the trailer, along with all her textbooks and the small jewelry box that held her mother's wedding ring. If she'd run away, she'd taken nothing with her. The initial search involved 40 volunteers from Tonopah and nearby Goldfield, spreading across the desert in lines like they were looking for lost cattle. They found old beer cans, sun-bleached bones from long-dead animals, and the scattered remnants of someone's abandoned campsite. But no trace of Angela. Martha Chen organized a candlelight vigil in the town square after 2 weeks. Nearly 300 people showed up, more than had gathered for anything in Tonopah in years. Angela's face smiled from photocopied flyers stapled to telephone poles and gas station bulletin boards, her dark hair and bright eyes frozen in time. She had dreams, Martha told the local news reporter who drove down from Reno. Real dreams, not just talk. She was going to be something more than this place usually allows. The investigation hit its first real lead when Tommy Valdez mentioned seeing Angela's car at the Silver Star Motel the night she disappeared. He'd been driving home from his girlfriend's house around 3:30 a.m. when he spotted the turquoise Cadillac in the motel parking lot. "I thought it was weird," Tommy told Kastner. "Angie never stayed at motels. She had her own place." Kastner drove to the Silver Star the next morning. The motel was a relic from the 1960s, when Highway 95 carried more traffic and Tonopah still believed it might grow into something bigger. 14 rooms in an L shape around a kidney-shaped pool that had been drained and painted blue to hide the cracks. Frank Dorsey had managed the Silver Star for 8 years. He was a stocky man with thick glasses and permanent stubble, the kind of person who minded his own business and expected others to do the same. His office smelled like old cigarettes and instant coffee. "I don't keep track of who comes and goes," Dorsey told Kastner, lighting another Marlboro. "People pay cash, use the room, move on. That's the business. But you'd remember if a local girl showed up in the middle of the night." Dorsey shrugged. "Maybe she was meeting someone. Maybe she needed a place to think. I don't ask questions." Room 6 had been occupied that night by a man who'd paid cash and signed the register as J. Martinez. The handwriting was careful, printed letters that looked practiced. Dorsey claimed he'd never seen the man before and couldn't provide much of a description. Average height, dark hair, quiet. Kastner processed Room 6 himself, dusting for fingerprints and searching for any trace evidence. He found dozens of prints, hair samples, and fabric fibers, the accumulated DNA of countless travelers. Nothing pointed definitively to Angela. As weeks turned to months, the case began to fade from daily conversation. The volunteers stopped calling with tips. The flyers on telephone poles became sun-faded and torn. Angela Pierce became another unsolved file in Kastner's cabinet, another ghost haunting the edges of a small town's memory. By Christmas of 1989, even Martha Chen had stopped mentioning Angela's name during the dinner rush. The Desert Rose Diner hired a new night shift waitress, a woman named Carol who was older and had fewer dreams about leaving Nevada. Life moved on, the way it always does in places where people disappear. But Detective Kastner kept Angela's file on his desk, occasionally pulling it out to review witness statements and crime scene photos. Something about the Silver Star Motel nagged at him, the way Frank Dorsey's eyes had avoided direct contact, the missing page from the guest registry, the way Room 6 had been cleaned so thoroughly before his arrival. The desert keeps its secrets, but Kastner had learned that secrets have a way of surfacing when you least expect them. Tonopah, Nevada, March 2025. The sledgehammer hit the concrete foundation with a sound like thunder rolling across the desert. Marcus Rivera wiped sweat from his forehead and squinted against the morning sun, already brutal despite the early hour. Renovating the abandoned Silver Star Motel was supposed to be a 6-month project, but the building was fighting them every step of the way. "This place doesn't want to be saved," joked his partner, Dave Chen, Martha's grandson, who'd returned to Tonopah with big plans and construction loans from a Reno bank. They were converting the motel into affordable housing, something the town desperately needed as mining operations slowly returned to the area. The Silver Star had been empty since 2018, when Frank Dorsey's son Carl finally gave up trying to keep it profitable. The neon sign had been dark for years, the pool filled with tumbleweeds and rainwater, the rooms sealed and slowly surrendering to the desert. Room 6 was proving the most stubborn. The foundation had settled unevenly, creating a gap between the concrete floor and the original wooden subfloor. Marcus had been trying to level it when his sledgehammer broke through into something hollow. "Dave, come look at this," Marcus called, kneeling beside the hole he'd accidentally created. Cool air drifted up from the darkness below, carrying a smell that made him step back, something old and wrong. Dave brought a flashlight and shined it into the gap. The beam revealed a crawl space about 3 feet high, running the length of the room. And there, wrapped in what looked like old motel bedsheets, was something that made both men understand they wouldn't be working on Room 6 anymore. "Call the sheriff," Dave said quietly. "Don't touch anything else." Sheriff Linda Hayes arrived 30 minutes later with the county coroner and a photographer. Hayes had been elected 2 years earlier, campaigning on a promise to modernize the department and revisit cold cases with new technology. She was young for the job at 42, but she'd grown up in Tonopah and understood how secrets could be buried in small towns. The crawl space had been sealed with concrete and hidden by the original flooring. Someone had gone to considerable effort to make it invisible. Along with the wrapped remains, investigators found a Silver Star Motel room key attached to a plastic tag marked 6 and a faded photograph of a young woman standing beside a turquoise Cadillac. Dr. Elizabeth Santos, the coroner, worked carefully to document everything before the remains were transported to the state crime lab in Las Vegas. The sheet wrapping had preserved more than she'd expected: fabric, hair samples, even traces of jewelry. "How long has this been down here?" Hayes asked. "Hard to say exactly without full analysis," Santos replied, photographing the key tag. "But this plastic looks like 1980s material, and these sheets—" She held up a corner of the faded fabric. "This is the same pattern the Silver Star used back then. I remember because my aunt worked here during summers when I was a kid." The photograph was the most haunting discovery. The woman looked happy, caught mid-laugh with one hand on the Cadillac's hood. Her dark hair fell past her shoulders, and she wore a Desert Rose Diner uniform. On the back, someone had written in blue ink, "Angela Summer 88, Dreams Coming True." Hayes had heard the name Angela Pierce in connection with old case files, but she'd been a child when the waitress disappeared. She drove to the sheriff's office and pulled the archived file, reading Detective Roy Kastner's careful reports and witness statements. Kastner had retired to Arizona in 2003, but he answered his phone on the second ring when Hayes called. "I always knew she was under that motel," he said after Hayes described the discovery. "Frank Dorsey lied to me from the beginning, but I could never prove it." "Is he still alive?" "Died in 2003, just after you retired. Heart attack." "Figures. What about his son Carl?" Hayes checked the current records. "Lives in Las Vegas. Has a landscaping business." "Bring him in," Kastner said, "and check the old evidence locker. There should be cigarette butts from room 6 that I collected in 1988. If they still have DNA on them." The state crime lab confirmed the remains were Angela Pierce within 2 weeks. Dental records matched perfectly, and carbon dating placed the burial between 1988 and 1990. But the real breakthrough came when DNA extracted from preserved cigarette butts matched samples from Carl Dorsey's landscaping business license. Sheriff Hayes drove to Las Vegas on a Thursday morning, accompanied by Detective Jim Walsh and a warrant for Carl Dorsey's arrest. They found him at a job site in Henderson, installing irrigation for a new development. He was 58 now, still stocky like his father, but with gray hair and permanent sun damage from decades of outdoor work. When Hayes showed him the photograph of Angela and the motel key, Carl Dorsey's face went completely white. "Saus, I need to call my lawyer," he said, sinking onto the tailgate of his work truck. But 37 years of carrying a secret had worn him down like water wearing a waystone. Before his lawyer arrived, Carl Dorsey began to talk. Las Vegas, Nevada, April 2025. The interview room at the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department was deliberately stark: white walls, fluorescent lighting, and a metal table bolted to the floor. Carl Dorsey sat across from Sheriff Hayes and Detective Walsh, his hands folded so tightly his knuckles had gone white. "My father wasn't a bad man," Carl began, his voice barely above a whisper. He had a temper when he'd been drinking. And that girl, Angela, she made him angry." Hayes had read enough confessions to know that this one would come in pieces, like assembling a puzzle with half the pieces lost. Carl's lawyer, Sandra Martinez, sat beside her client taking careful notes, occasionally advising him to stop or clarify a point. The story that emerged over the next 3 hours was both simpler and more complex than anyone had imagined. Angela Pierce had been having an affair with Frank Dorsey for 6 months before she disappeared. It had started innocently. She'd come to the motel looking for a quiet place to study, and Frank had offered her room 6 at a discount during slow periods. They were both lonely people in a lonely town, and loneliness has its own gravity. "She wanted to end it," Carl continued. "Dad told me she came to the motel that night to break things off, said she was serious about moving to Reno, starting over clean. Frank Dorsey hadn't taken the rejection well. He'd been drinking steadily since his wife left him 2 years earlier, and Angela's departure felt like another abandonment. The argument had escalated quickly in room 6, voices rising loud enough that a guest in room 8 had called the front desk to complain. "I was working the night shift," Carl said. "Dad had been drinking all evening, and when I went to check on the noise complaint—" He paused, swallowing hard. She was on the floor. He said she'd hit her head on the table during the argument, but I could see his hands were shaking. What happened next was the secret that had haunted Carl Dorsey for 37 years. Instead of calling for help, Frank had convinced his 21-year-old son to help cover up what he claimed was an accident. He said nobody would believe us, said they'd think he killed her on purpose, and I'd go to prison too for helping him move the body. Carl's voice cracked. "I was just a kid. I was scared." They had wrapped Angela in motel sheets and hidden her in Frank's office until the next morning. Then, while Carl kept watch, Frank had used a jackhammer to break through the concrete foundation of room 6, creating the crawl space that would become Angela's tomb. "I heard her," Carl whispered, the words seeming to surprise him as they came out. "When we were moving her, I heard her breathing. She wasn't dead yet." The revelation hung in the air like smoke from a wildfire. Detective Walsh leaned forward, his voice gentle but insistent. "Are you saying Angela was still alive when you buried her?" Carl nodded, tears finally coming. "Dad said she was unconscious, that she'd die from the head injury anyway. He made me promise never to tell anyone, said it would destroy both our lives." But there was more. Carl had kept Angela's car keys, disposing of the Cadillac at a junkyard in Beatty 3 days later. He'd also kept the photograph found with her body, a memento that had tortured him for decades, but that he couldn't bring himself to destroy. "Every time I drove past that motel, I could hear her," he said. "In my dreams, in quiet moments. I knew she was still there, waiting for someone to find her." The district attorney in Nye County faced a difficult decision. Carl Dorsey was guilty of accessory to murder and conspiracy to conceal a death, but he was also a victim of his father's manipulation and fear. After months of negotiations, he agreed to plead guilty to accessory after the fact in exchange for 5 years, probation and community service. Frank Dorsey was posthumously charged with second-degree murder, though justice for Angela Pierce would have to remain symbolic. On a warm October morning, Angela Pierce was finally laid to rest in the Tonopah Cemetery, 37 years after her disappearance. Nearly 400 people attended the service, many who had never known her, but who understood that her story was their story, the story of secrets buried in small places. Detective Roy Kastner made the drive from Arizona, now 83, and walking with a cane. He placed a single white rose on Angela's coffin and whispered something only he could hear. The Silver Star Motel was torn down completely after Angela's discovery. Dave Chen built his affordable housing project on the other side of town instead, saying the land needed to rest. Where the motel once stood, the desert has begun to reclaim the space, creosote bushes and desert grass growing through the cracked foundation. On quiet nights, when the wind blows across Highway 95 and the stars shine bright enough to read by, people in Tonopah sometimes remember the young woman who dreamed of becoming a nurse. The Desert Rose Diner still serves coffee to late-night travelers, and occasionally someone will ask about the girl in the old photograph hanging behind the register, Angela Pierce, smiling beside her turquoise Cadillac, forever 24 and full of hope. The desert keeps its secrets, but sometimes, when the time is right, it gives them back. Tonopah, Nevada. 6 months later, the morning sun cast long shadows across the empty lot where the Silver Star Motel once stood, but Detective Sarah Mitchell wasn't looking at the cleared ground. She was studying the stack of files that had arrived on her desk 3 days earlier. 7 missing persons cases from Nevada, California, and Utah, all dating between 1985 and 1995, all involving young women who had vanished near highway motels. Mitchell had transferred to Nye County Sheriff's Office specifically to work cold cases, drawn by the publicity surrounding Angela Pierce's discovery. At 35, she had spent a decade with the Las Vegas Metro Police, specializing in pattern recognition and database analysis. Angela's case had made her wonder how many other secrets were buried along America's forgotten highways. Frank Dorsey traveled, she explained to Sheriff Hayes during their weekly case review meeting. "I've been tracking his employment history. He worked at motels from Bakersfield to Salt Lake City before settling in Tonopah. Always night manager positions. Always places that catered to transient guests." Hayes studied the map Mitchell had created, red pins marking each location where Dorsey had worked, blue pins marking unsolved disappearances of young women within a 50-mile radius. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Tammy Rodriguez, 19, disappeared from Elias, Nevada in 1987. Last seen at the Copper Queen Motel where Dorsey worked for 6 months, Mitchell pointed to each case file. Lisa Chen, no relation to our Dave Chen, vanished from Baker in California in 1989. Dorsey had been night manager at the Desert Inn there until 3 weeks before she disappeared. The most compelling case was Jennifer Walsh, a 22-year-old college student who had vanished from Wendover, Utah in 1991. Security footage from a gas station showed her talking to a man who matched Dorsey's description outside the Sunset Lodge, where Frank Dorsey had worked as assistant manager. "I've contacted the families," Mitchell continued. "Jennifer's mother, Catherine Walsh, drove down from Salt Lake City yesterday. She's been fighting for 34 years to keep her daughter's case active." Catherine Walsh was a retired teacher with silver hair and the kind of quiet determination that comes from decades of unanswered questions. She sat in the sheriff's office conference room, carefully arranged photos of Jennifer, spread across the table like tarot cards, predicting an unknown future. "Jennifer was driving home from spring break in California," Catherine explained, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "Her car broke down just outside Wendover. She called me from the motel, said a nice man at the front desk was going to help her find a mechanic in the morning." The parallels to Angela's case were striking. Both women were young, alone, trusting of a man in a position of authority. Both had disappeared without taking their belongings, without accessing their bank accounts, without any trace except the memories of people who loved them. Sheriff Hayes authorized Mitchell to form a multi-jurisdictional task force, working with law enforcement agencies across 3 states. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit provided a psychological profile of Frank Dorsey based on the Angela Pierce case and the emerging pattern of disappearances. "Dorsey fits the profile of an opportunistic predator," explained Special Agent Maria Santos during a video conference from Quantico. "He targeted vulnerable young women in isolated locations where he had both access and authority. The fact that he convinced his son to help cover up Angela's death suggests a manipulative personality with strong control over those around him." The investigation expanded rapidly. Ground-penetrating radar teams were dispatched to 4 former motel locations where Dorsey had worked. Archaeological teams followed, carefully excavating areas where the radar detected anomalies. At the former Desert Inn in Baker, California, investigators found fabric fragments and personal jewelry buried beneath what had once been the motel's laundry room. The items were too degraded for positive identification, but one piece, a small silver cross on a chain, matched the description of jewelry worn by Lisa Chen when she disappeared. The Copper Queen Motel in Ely had been demolished in 2010, but investigators focused on the adjacent vacant lot. 3 feet beneath the surface, they uncovered a cache of personal items, driver's licenses, credit cards, and photographs that had been carefully preserved in plastic bags. Among them was Tammy Rodriguez's Nevada State University student ID, her face smiling from a photo taken just weeks before her disappearance. Each discovery brought new media attention to the case. The story of the Highway Motel killer spread across social media and true crime podcasts, generating hundreds of tips from people who remembered strange encounters at roadside motels during the 1980s and 1990s. Carl Dorsey, serving his probation in Las Vegas, agreed to additional interviews with investigators. The weight of his father's true nature was becoming clear, and he struggled to reconcile the man who had raised him with the predator that evidence suggested. "He never talked about other women," Carl told Detective Mitchell during a recorded session, "but there were nights when he'd come home really late, his clothes dirty, and he'd do laundry immediately. So I thought it was just because the motel work was messy." Carl remembered his father keeping a storage unit in Tonopah, paying the rent in cash every month until his death. When investigators obtained a warrant to search the unit, they found boxes of motel records, guest registries, and photographs, a collection spanning 20 years of Frank Dorsey's career in the hospitality industry. Hidden in a false bottom of one box were driver's licenses from 7 different women, including Angela Pierce. Each license had been carefully preserved, along with small personal items, an earring, a hair clip, a lipstick tube, trophies from victims whose stories were only beginning to be understood. The investigation eventually identified remains or evidence linking Frank Dorsey to 11 missing women across 4 states. Not all the cases could be definitively proven. Some evidence had been lost over decades. Some locations had been developed or changed beyond recognition, but the pattern was clear, and for the first time in decades, families had answers. Jennifer Walsh's remains were discovered beneath the concrete floor of a storage shed behind the former Sunset Lodge in Wendover. Catherine Walsh was 71 when she finally buried her daughter, surrounded by friends and family who had waited 34 years for closure. "I used to wonder if Jennifer was still alive somewhere, maybe with amnesia or starting a new life," Catherine said at the memorial service. "The truth is horrible, but at least I know now. She can rest, and so can I." The Highway Motel killer case became a landmark investigation, leading to changes in how law enforcement agencies share information about missing persons across state lines. Detective Mitchell was promoted to lead the newly formed Western States Cold Case Task Force, dedicated to identifying patterns in unsolved disappearances along America's highway system. Frank Dorsey's crimes might have remained hidden forever, if not for the renovation of the Silver Star Motel and the discovery of Angela Pierce's body. But secrets have weight, and eventually, the weight becomes too much for the ground to bear. Today, a small memorial garden sits where the Silver Star Motel once stood. 11 white roses bloom there each spring, one for each confirmed victim of Frank Dorsey's 20-year killing spree. The roses are tended by volunteers from Tonopah, people who understand that remembering the dead is one way of ensuring their stories never disappear. Highway 95 still carries travelers through the Nevada desert, past towns with flickering neon signs and motels that promise rest for the weary. But now, when young women find themselves alone on those empty roads, they call home, they check in with friends. They remember that not all strangers can be trusted, and that sometimes the most dangerous person is the one offering help. The desert keeps its secrets, but some secrets are too dark to stay buried forever. And sometimes, when justice finally comes, it arrives not with fanfare but with the quiet satisfaction of truth finally told, of questions finally answered, of the dead finally at peace.